Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Culture Shock Podcast, where we talk about things that shock the culture forever. Today is a part 2 to the Y2K episode, where in part 1 we talked about more of the traditional values of Y2K, and today we're going to be talking about the anti-Y2K movement, which has been coined the Attitude Era. So let's go ahead and get started. So, the Attitude Era, or the Older Brother Core movement, or middle finger culture, whatever you want to call it, was this movement that started around the mid-90s that spread into the new millennium of people just not caring what people thought anymore, which led to a movement of some of the most crude, offensive, inappropriate, and vulgar media and lifestyle choices that have ever been made as a culture, really creating the counterculture to the Y2K movement, where everybody was trying to be optimistic in the Y2K movement. This was the exact opposite. These people were doing stuff just because they wanted to and just because they could. And that was a sentiment that really defined this era overall. People wanted to really show and push the boundaries overall of what can be considered acceptable. And where this really came into fruition was what can be acceptable for media and how can we target this to an audience to still make it successful, but still make it to where we can kind of cut loose and do whatever we want. Some of the biggest media at the time that involved this was a lot of TV shows and movies. Where the movies started to blow up with this type of humor and attitude was the reintroduction of rated R teen raunchy comedies. With, of course, the biggest one being the movie franchise American Pie. American Pie is one of the most successful comedy franchises still ever made, and at this time, this really was a force of this Attitude Era. The whole movie is extremely raunchy. I don't know how much I can get into on YouTube to even talk about some of the more adult themes in American Pie, but when American Pie first hit the scenes, it really redefined what a teenage comedy can be and really defined what teenagers were looking for coming into this new millennium that wasn't super PC, but still wasn't unattainable to them. It still wasn't so inappropriate that parents were scared, but it still wasn't something that you were going to watch with your family. And what really profited this movie to be pushed to one of the more successful teen movies ever made was how shocking the movie was. And that was a big thing with this Attitude Era. It wanted to shock the public. It wanted to show how much that people didn't care, that they would do radical stuff to show that they didn't want to have to appease what was going on in society. Which brings us to the next big piece of this media, the TV show Jackass. Jackass was a TV show that was made on MTV that really just took the Attitude Era by definition and made it into a TV show. Jackass was a TV show that followed these four men who would just do extreme crazy dares in public. Like, they would have one of their characters get stapled in the middle of a schoolyard, or they would have another character who would get into a barrel and go down a waterfall 200 feet. It was very big things that did not fit adults doing in societal norms, and people loved this show. People still to this day love this show. Another form of TV that got a rise during this era was the rise of adult cartoons. Adult cartoons have always been kind of shocking. That's kind of what they profited on, but it was nothing like what it got to in this point. Some of the biggest shows at this point that really defined this generation were in this adult cartoon genre, especially the biggest one, South Park. And South Park took what people thought a television show can be with its boundaries and completely broke the boundaries in half. Some of these plots of these episodes, to even say out loud, sound ridiculous. Like, in one episode, the main character kills a little boy's parents and then makes him eat them in front of a group of people. Another episode completely destroys the Mormon religion. Another episode, I can just go on for hours and hours about crazy things that have happened in this show. And a really big scare that was happening with the adult cartoon phrase was that first and foremost, they were cartoons. So a big problem in the Attitude Era, but especially with its media, was it was targeted towards adults. It was always marketed to adults. But with a lot of things in life, once kids truly attach onto it, is when they truly blow up. So South Park being a cartoon really made parents think it was okay for kids to watch it. Same thing with a lot of the other things, like American Pie took place with teenagers in it. They thought it was okay for teenagers. So the Attitude Era really pushed not just the boundaries for what adults were watching, but a lot of the boundaries for what kids and young adults were going through and watching themselves. Besides film and television, this era also encompassed a bunch of other types of media, one of the biggest ones being sports. In the late 90s, the two biggest things that were on the rise were professional wrestling and skateboarding. The WWF at the time, which was the World Wrestling Federation, really kind of were the forefront for the Attitude Era outside of television, as in TV shows. And yes, I know that the WWE and professional wrestling of that vein are not traditional sports and they are very prefabricated, but I included them in this topic because I felt like that they still did have the qualities of a sport, but especially how it was played at this time was that this was the main sport for families to watch all together and for people to really witness in alternative culture at the time. And at this time, around 1997, they started introducing some of the most ridiculous plot lines, like that there were leprechauns living underneath the ring and the Big Show came and killed them. And they also had like crazy, vulgar, sexual things happening on stage. It was just really played for shock value, and it really worked. It really set the WWF apart at this time and really solidified them as a mainstay in the Attitude Era, especially with the villains that they had at the time, like Stone Cold Steve Austin. He lived and breathed Attitude Era America and really became an icon for this movement. And something that was just as big as the WWF was skateboarding and skateboard culture. At this time, that was the thing to do if you were an alternative teenager. Everyone was learning how to skateboard. It became something to do more commonly. But where it became really big as a sport was the introduction of the X Games and Tony Hawk as an icon himself. And even though the sport itself was super big, where it became really big into the youth culture was the video games based around Tony Hawk himself, like Tony Hawk Pro Skater and the Skate franchise of video games were really also really big in this alternative culture. And what people really think of as the older brother core version of the Attitude Era really stems from these video games and Xbox overall as a game console and movement. And the last, and arguably one of the most important parts of this movement, was the music that arrived during this time. What really was the voice of this generation was pop punk and nu metal. Pop punk really blew up into this movement with the band Blink-182 and their reinventive lyrics that weren't super serious. A lot of rock became really serious before this movement started, so they wanted to make something that was fun, almost funny, and making fun of the movement. And their songs like What's My Age Again and All the Small Things were anthems for this movement. And just as big as pop punk was nu metal, and nu metal was a brand new thing. Like, pop punk evolved over time into what it became in the Attitude Era, but nu metal was really big. But who was the icon of nu metal was Limp Bizkit, but especially their lead singer, Fred Durst. He really brought the attitude of I do not care what people think about me. He would directly call out celebrities in the crowd. He would do shocking things on stage, but people once again loved what he was doing, and he became a vessel and inspiration to a lot of young men at the time. They wanted to be just like Fred Durst. But who people were not expecting to rise at this time was the rapper named Marshall Mathers, or as people more commonly know him, Eminem. Eminem lived and breathed this attitude, similar to some of the other icons, but no one was able to touch what Eminem was doing. He was starting whole wars between celebrities. He was just known as the attitude guy. And he was like that from the beginning of his career through almost to the end of his career. He still has this vessel, an impact on people still to this day. Even movies were made about him, like 8 Mile. He was really an icon for this movement. But what ended up happening to this movement? Why did it die? Unlike the hope core of Y2K, the Attitude Era lasted very long. It lived up to about 2007, 2008. But why it ended up ending was these Attitude Era icons. Yes, they were icons of the moment, but they were very young. This was a movement of young people. And when you get older, that disrespect attitude in the attitude of the Attitude Era, you kind of grow out of. It's an attitude of young adults and young men especially. So when these young men grew up and started families and became business owners, they no longer could live into this middle finger culture. They had to grow up eventually. But this culture did kind of shift a little bit onto early internet culture, where even through to around 2015, people were still having moments that were similar to the Attitude Era, but it was never to where it was in its heyday. This has been the deep dive on the Attitude Era. Thank y'all so much for listening. For more information, you can check out me on _Culture Shock podcast on Instagram, where I give a little bit more of a visual element to my podcast episodes. And I also have moments where y'all can interact as well with things such as polls and questionnaires for next week's episodes and future episodes to come. Once again, thank you so much for listening, and come back next week where we talk about all things that shock the culture.